Welcome to the Today's Leader podcast. Building tomorrow's best leaders, today.
Way to go, guys. Way to go. Keep it going. Good job, guys. All right, Paul, I see you. All right, finish. Coach Carl.
Great job, guys.
Hey there, it's Coach Curl here, and welcome to episode 392 of the Today's Leader podcast, leading a revolution to build tomorrow's best leaders today. Now, every guest that we have on the podcast has a purpose. It's a common trait that we see time and time again. They've got a very clear purpose, a very clear mission. And today's episode is absolutely no exception. Today we're going to talk about financial dignity and the role that leaders need to be playing. Our guest is Anita Ward, and she's been recognized as an organizational shaman, a catalyst for transformational change, and one of the top 100 Fintech for Sustainable Development Goals Influencers in the world. A cultural anthropologist by training, Anita has led organizations through seemingly daunting challenges to find economic success through noble purpose, inclusion, and the delivery of dignity in the workplace and community. I'm hoping that you're picking up the common threads that just from Anita's bio. Currently, Anita is serving as the Chief Development Officer for Salary Finance US, a social purpose financial wellbeing fintech, and recipient of more than 90 recognitions for financial inclusion, innovation, and social impact. Financial dignity of the people that you lead is something which does impact performance, individual success, and individual self-worth. And leaders can help unlock the magic of their team with just a few steps and just a few hints and tips that Anita provides today. She shares some great insight into conscious and intentional leadership along our journey. And it's my pleasure, after a word from our sponsor, to welcome Anita Ward to the podcast.
The podcast is brought to you by Think and Grow Business, the home of the Think and Grow Business Mastermind. If you're serious about growing your business, get serious and join a mastermind group today. Find out more at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au.
And it's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, Building Tomorrow's Best Leaders Today. Please welcome Anita Ward, the Chief Development Officer for Salary Finance US. How are you, Anita?
Thank you. I'm so well today. Thank you for having me.
And it's a good afternoon to you, and it's a good morning to me, because I am the future, as
I
you
was
would just
thinking
say.
the same thing. You already are experiencing my future, which sounds pretty spectacular.
Anita, tell our audience a little bit of the Anita Ward story.
Oh, it's not terribly interesting, and probably not unlike many other people. But I was embarrassed to share my story until a few years ago. So let me start with a little bit of vulnerability here. I am in the financial services sector, have been for most of my career. Yet the secret is that before I was 15 years old, my family lived in 13 different places, 10 cities, and 4 or 5 states. And for most of my childhood, we were homeless in many ways. Not homeless in the sense that I lived in a box under a bridge, but homeless in the sense that I didn't have an address I could point to. We couch surfed in homes of friends and family, and the secret was that my parents weren't financially literate. They really struggled hard to figure it all out, and they had an extended family and an ecosystem they could rely upon. But I remember most vividly when I was about 15 years old. There were 4 kids, and mom and dad, and I don't know that this translates, but I suspect U-Haul has something in Australia as well. But basically, they put us in a U-Haul trailer and left what was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and went across the country to Las Vegas, Nevada. And you've seen plenty of movies about Las Vegas. It was also going to be my daddy's dream. It was the place where we were going to finally figure it out. And that U-Haul for a long time became our home. We stayed at a rest stop in the Las Vegas desert. And I was really fortunate because I found a job. I found a job at McDonald's, of all things, of all places. And it is there where I learned the power of an employer to care. Because the manager of that McDonald's figured out there was something going wrong. And there was something unusual about me. And I remember getting my first paycheck. And first I was astonished because I thought it was going to be so much more. I had never really experienced taxes and benefits or anything. And so he took the time and explained it to me, but then he asked me, do I have a bank account? And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, now that you've heard my story, I did not. I mean, banking to us was, the big wheel at Binion's Casino. We really didn't have that financial infrastructure. So he helped me set up a bank account. He gave me what I think of as dignity. He let me take food home for the family. And it was such a wonderful experience for me because unlike many, I'm sure he had plenty of options, but this was an unusual person who cared very deeply. And in many ways, it became my lesson for leadership. It became my lesson for the power of an employer. And I think it also started to shape what I studied in school because despite, having run technology and companies, I'm a cultural anthropologist, which actually, Australia, I should come because that would be my field work, right? But I became a cultural anthropologist. So this one individual, this one manager, changed my life, my family's life, and to this day, he is, probably completely unaware of the impact that he had on 6 lives. It's pretty spectacular guy.
Absolutely, and what a powerful story. And I might just say that some of the best people start their careers at McDonald's. My very first job was in McDonald's as well. So
there you have it. That's proof right there.
They've got a great history of training and delivering the right standards. But that's a really interesting story. So I was reading through, doing my research around financial, what it is that you do with salary finance. And the term unbanked came up. And that's a term we don't use in Australia. So is that what you were talking about, where, people that actually don't have a bank account?
Yes, and there are at least 7 million of them. So there are individuals for many reasons don't have a bank account. Some of them are like my family, where they just were financially illiterate. Some of them don't have the identification that you need to open a bank account here in the U.S. So they may have, come to the U.S. and maybe outstayed a visa or maybe here under, migrant status, and so they don't have identification. They don't have the documentation that they need. So there are many people who are marginalized, and frankly, speaking as an anthropologist, there are many communities that don't trust banks. So they keep the money in the mayonnaise jar, in the kitchen, or
under the mattress.
Under the mattress, and so there are a number of reasons why people aren't banked. But at the same time, what that does is it impacts their ability to, function in so many ways, in particular to access capital when you need it, but also in many ways just to participate in what is becoming, less and less a cash society and more a digital society. So it makes for very difficult circumstances, but also maintains communities that are very much marginalized and more vulnerable to financial shocks.
Yeah. So within the system, like you've got your own personal story about the financial hardships that your family faced and the impacts that ultimately had on yourself. What are some of those other impacts that we see within whether it's within the family or whether it's within the community, of this financial, let's call it distress, ultimately, because people aren't making whether they've got financial backing behind them or whether they don't. They're in some level of stress in relation to their finances. What are some of the negative impacts that we then see from that?
So there are, as I said, maybe some of the estimates are pretty high, like 20% of households in the US are unbanked. But what happens is that they lack emergency savings. So they have trouble paying bills. They don't have a liquid savings account. They have to borrow from family or friends. When they need to borrow, they have to go to predatory lenders, so outside of the traditional financial services sector.
Yeah.
But as importantly, there are mental and physical health issues associated with financial stress. So when you're unbanked, it really does perpetuate stress in your life. You worry about, how are you going to make ends meet? How do you get a credit card if you need it? All of the things that you and I may take for granted. And what happens is it compounds this stress in people's lives, and they become ill. They become physically ill. They become, mentally challenged. They have anxiety at far greater rates than individuals who aren't experiencing financial stress. If
Yeah.
they're working, I read somewhere that they're 9 times more likely to have troubled relationships at home with colleagues and with family and friends. And so it creates a much more difficult situation for people, both physically and mentally, the stress that's compounded through the failure to have access to financial services.
And I'd imagine for most people and for most leaders that our thoughts around our financial status, no matter where we are in life, is always primary in front of mind. Whether it's buying our next Lamborghini, where does my money come from that? Or whether it's buying, where's my meal for the next, where's my next meal coming from? I know that they're two ridiculous examples, but the financial thought process is always front and center for the majority of people, I would imagine. So then I love the concept of financial dignity. I really like that word. So then we've talked a little bit about the negative impacts around financial distress. What happens when people start to see that financial dignity in life? What are then some of the corresponding positive impacts that we see?
So there's a wonderful continuum that measures financial health. And it's a 1 to 5 scoring system that starts with struggling and ends up with prospering. And what the
Yeah.
data has said in terms of the research is that if individuals can get just to the point of saving $200 and getting their credit score to a 600 credit score, that there's a shift. There's a shift in their confidence level. There's a shift in the joy of their life. There's a shift in their feeling of control over the situation. And with that comes all of the positives that you can think of, both the mental positives. You have control. Dignity is very much about having control of your world, but also having control of the perception of you. So I started off by saying that I didn't like to share my story. In some ways, I felt embarrassed by the situation and wanted to, brush that under a rug. But the truth
Yeah.
is that the more control that I have as a leader and the greater that I found my financial dignity, I thought it's important to share this back, because at that point, once you have dignity, then you have more flexibility in your life. You can save
Yeah.
for the future. You have a future. You have a tomorrow. You have hope. It is a very aspirational piece. It's very. I talk a lot about the physical implications with ulcers and stress, and conditions that are brought on by financial stress. But there's also the mental piece of low confidence and high confidence. There's a mental association with poverty and one with wealth. And if we can shift that mindset from low self confidence to high self confidence, from not understanding the language of money to speaking the language of money, then what you're doing is you're giving people hope and aspiration as well. So
Yeah.
think about your own account when you see just a little bit more in there, or if you see it growing, or you have your 401k, or you have a retirement piece set aside. You're much more in control of your life. You don't have anxiety attacks, and you have a pathway to the future that when you're suffering from mental stress you don't have. Your examples weren't quite so ludicrous as you might think, because there are many people in our country who live paycheck to paycheck,
Yeah.
and half of our country, nearly half, doesn't have $400 in savings. So where do
Wow.
you go when a financial shock hits? And even on the other end of the scale, individuals, 28% of them who make $168,000 a year, live paycheck to paycheck. And so we have a very large financial problem here in the U.S.
Mm.
Some of it, I think, is related to our healthcare costs, which are undoubtedly quite different from your own. But we
Yeah.
see at Salary Finance that people are using it to get out of bad debt. We have a
Yeah.
growing debt problem here. So a lot of people use our services to get out of very expensive debt.
It's when you talked about emergency savings, my initial thought was, and to be able to utilize that whenever the crisis hits. And I'd imagine for most people, it might be the car breaks down, or that there's some emergency repairs needed around the home, or something like that. So that's where our emergency savings kick in. It's probably fair to say that the world didn't have a lot of emergency savings sitting there for us to combat this crisis that we know as COVID, because ultimately now where we, and I know this is just a general observation that I'm making, but where we currently sit from a borrowings perspective from most countries in the world nowadays is putting us in a bit of a frightening position moving forward. Now, conscious capitalism, that was another term that piqued my interest when I was doing my research, Anita. So tell me about conscious capitalism.
Yes. Might I first, just as a secondary thought to what you were just talking about, I think this is so important, the point you were making about the pandemic, because I think what we've learned is that employers, like the McDonald's for me, and possibly even for yourself, but employers play such a big role, a much larger role now in the mental and financial health of employees. And I think the pandemic really put a spotlight on it. I know with
Yeah.
salary finance now, we're coming in as an employee benefit. So employers
Oh,
are bringing
wow.
us into the workplace and then offering our savings and lending and financial literacy to their employees as a benefit, just to try to get them healthy. So I think the role of the employer became much more obvious, that financial well-being isn't just about my salary or providing a good salary anymore. It's about, how do you encourage liquid savings? How do you encourage long-term retirement? How do you provide access, inclusive access to capital when people need it? And that's a very different paradigm for many HR leaders and many CEOs who are saying, how can I help you? So while I think the pandemic was incredibly devastating in so many ways, there might be a glimmer of hope in that. I believe that employers have now recognized their need to do like that manager did for me at McDonald's, and lean in and help people find their financial dignity. And
Yeah.
that kind of comes full circle to why I am an avid proponent of conscious capitalism. So conscious capitalism was a movement started by John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, and Raj Sisodia, a professor at Babson, maybe 20 years ago now. And the idea was that you could elevate humanity through business. Well, I'm a social scientist. I have those deep anthropological roots. So for me, this idea that you could elevate humanity through business, that
Yeah.
you could do good and at the same time you could do really well as a business, just rang true to me. So
Yeah.
I believe that as a conscious capitalist, you do the right things for people. You lead with purpose. You lead with a mission that's committed to caring, and you lift up people internally through capitalism. You provide opportunities. So this idea of humility and purpose and being aligned much more with your stakeholders, including your employees, sit at the
Yeah.
foundations of who I am as a leader and as a conscious capitalist.
Excellent, excellent. With the what you were mentioning around businesses now bringing you in, what are some of the things that business can do to actually help promote the concept of financial dignity with their teams and with their people?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's almost like what was that a grief? You know how you accept your grief and then you move on. I think you first have to accept that there's a problem.
Yeah,
And many businesses are concerned that when you talk about financial dignity or you talk about financial wellness, that it is somehow a measurement of how well they pay somebody. That is not the case anymore. So, the first thing you can do when you're thinking about financial wellness is is talk to your employees and communicate well. Know that it is okay, but give them open and safe space. It's an important part of what we think of as the ethnography of the workforce. Speaking
yeah,
anthropologically, right? Find out day to day what is it like? What's it like at the end of the month for your customer service representative? What happens when they chip a tooth? And here in the U.S., we don't have socialized medicine. We don't have socialized healthcare. So we have healthcare, private healthcare that requires a deductible. And many people simply can't afford the deductible. So when you chip a tooth, you can't wait until you've budgeted to pay for it, or you break your arm, or you need an MRI.
yeah,
I think nearly 30% of what salary finance is used for as a benefit is related to medical issues. So, as a leader, if you want to think about financial wellness, embrace the fact that within our ecosystem, there are many unexpected financial shocks. It's not always a pandemic. It's my
yeah,
son who, needs to see a doctor, or my mom, or my transmission went out on my car and I don't have $4,000 or whatever it is to replace that, yet I've got to get to work. So in the day-to-day lives of your employees, there are financial shocks all around us. And it doesn't take a crazy virus and time off from work to illustrate that. And so people run out of money at the end. You can budget, but get hit with one of those shocks and your budget is gone. I joke that my mom was probably a better budgeter than any CFO that I know. But that doesn't mean that we didn't, people don't need to learn how to budget. They need to have access to the tools that help them move along this financial continuum. Most people know how to build a budget. So we should,
yeah,
the focus shouldn't be on teaching budget building. It should be on providing access to capital. It should be on building up savings accounts, things that I think of as interventions along your financial wellness journey. So
yeah,
I think that the first thing you have to do is embrace what it's like in the day in the life of your employees, understand what that
yeah,
means, and create this no judgment zone. Because there are a lot of Anitas with the same Anita story. They may be living in their cars right now. They may be living with friends or family now. So create this no judgment zone that says that finds out exactly what it is that your employees are experiencing. So you've got to know your workforce. And there are a couple of people who might be really great with this in your own organization. Um, Here in the US, and I think in Australia as well, the diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a very important part of our business world. So, chief diversity officers are often very skilled in creating safe spaces for conversations. Maybe
yeah,
address this inclusion through your DEI initiatives or through your ESG initiatives, but really start to understand and assess what's going on with your workforce by listening to them and knowing them and building the communities and doing a little bit of anthropological ethnography within that. And I think then you'll start to frame your social purpose and understand where you're headed.
In many ways, I'd imagine it's really about understanding your team, which is, but also understanding the communities in which we live. So, for example, our Indigenous here in Australia have a very strong extended family structure, and many times that leads to there may only be one or two people in that extended family structure who are actually on some level of secure income. But then that community expectation is that they're helping support the community. So I guess you would also see that, especially within the multicultural diversity that is America, you'd see that there's some real strong community expectations around, the realities of what individuals face.
Yes, that's very true. And those even got extended last 2 years with COVID, because what we saw was 33% of the working Americans depleted all their savings because they were helping a friend or a family. So the
Yeah.
expectations got elevated. But you're right, in a steady state, our Hispanic communities are strong family communities. And so there is an expectation of, how do you support the community as well as your family, because your family's just one element in that broader community. So
Yeah.
there are very, very different lenses through which we can look at back to your workforce question, look at your workforce, but recognize also that you operate within a community. And so, what are the broader community implications of the decisions that you're making internally around financial well being? And there are many people who would argue that employers have the greatest positioning to uplift communities through these
Yeah.
decisions that they're making. So, an employee is just one part of the community within which you're interacting and building your business.
Yeah. You'd imagine most businesses would think of themselves, or hope that they would think of themselves, as being a positive contributor to the communities in which they operate. And it's those businesses that don't feel like that are ultimately the ones that are shunned or fail within certain communities. So there is that really strong community connection back to business, which is really quite odd, because a lot of people look to any level of government that they're the ones that are responsible and they should be fixing. But I think in hindsight and experience that it's probably the communities, the businesses that operate in communities, that may have a much greater impact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Oh, and so I'm anxious, both as a scientist and a researcher, to look at the impacts, particularly in the U.S., of COVID on small business, because in many ways the small businesses held those communities together, and they took the
Yeah.
biggest hits here in the U.S. So many of them have closed as a result of the pandemic, and so it will be quite fascinating to see how do the larger businesses, fill those gaps. What will happen when it comes to community, and how might that get supported overall? Hopefully, there will be many more, conscious capitalists who fill in there and extend communities and help regrow small businesses. I know that JP
Yeah.
Morgan Chase has a huge initiative. I think it's $90 billion to help put back into communities to help close that. There's a wonderful managing director named Alice Rodriguez who's leading that effort for JP Morgan Chase. And so I think you will see businesses stepping up and saying, how do we make this work? And outside of regulation, we here in the U.S. have regulations, and we have ESG frameworks, and I'm sure you do as well, where businesses have to operate within environmental, social, and governance guidelines and frameworks. But those tend to be more regulatory. What I'm talking about is just doing the right thing and leading with purpose
Yeah.
and leading with mission, and filling in those gaps that were created over the last several years.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anita, who's been the inspiration behind your leadership journey?
Oh, so many. I have been so fortunate standing on the shoulders of some pretty great people. But there's one person in particular who gave me some advice, and it was really the pivot in my world. Much the same way that manager was a pivot. I was very fortunate to be part of the executive team at Chase, which is where I spent most of my career. And I recall making a presentation to the board, and it was on an initiative I was leading. And I was so excited about it because we had looked at everything from the customer perspective. It was all this human centered design, it was about purpose, it was about community. And I was just thrilled. And on this board were some icons, like President
Yeah.
Ford was on the board, and Barbara Jordan, a congresswoman, was. I mean, this was an iconic board. But there was only one person on that board that I actually cared about, and his name is Herb Kelleher. Herb Kelleher was the founder of Southwest Airlines. I don't think
Okay, yeah.
Southwest flies to Australia, but
But Southwest Airlines is legendary in the moments of truth analogy that they have.
absolutely, yes, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, Herb was everything to me. And I remember I'm pitching this and talking about all we're doing, and everybody was like, "High five, Anita, that's great." Herb stopped me afterwards. He said, "Anita, that was wonderful. But before you focus on your customers, what are you doing for your employees?" And I have to tell you, as an anthropologist, I thought, oh my God, I have failed. I have failed because I didn't even think about that. He said, you will always have a satisfied customer if you have a satisfied employee. Go get the employee piece right and the rest will happen. Well, for me, one, I adored Herb. And so I thought, this is, which is exactly what, he's all about, right? He got the employee piece right and then built this legendary airline. And he was right. So in some ways, my greatest influence was potentially, or at least me emotionally, my greatest failure. Because as an anthropologist, it should have been just intuitive to me that, of course, you start with employees. But I got
Yeah.
so excited about building products and focusing on customers and driving revenue that I missed the most obvious part of the equation. And so Herb has been the greatest influence on me, bar none. But I will tell you, in the last year, I've another incredible influence has come. And I don't know if you've read it. Have you read Hubert Joly's book called The Heart of Business?
No, I haven't.
This has become a bit of my new Bible. I think it came out about 6 months ago, but Hubert Joly was responsible for the turnaround of Best Buy. And
Okay.
he talks about how he did it and what it took and what it means to unleash human magic, and how
Yep.
you give autonomy to people, how you embrace this open environment, how you drive with purpose, but how you put people at the center of it. So for me, he's a bit of an extension of what Herb taught me in the early days, but I think that Hubert shows what it's like now in, what was Herb, 1990 maybe? I mean, he started much before then, but I think when I met him, it was 1996. So here I am 25 years later looking at it and saying, look what Hubert's doing. And this idea of human magic for me and the role of the leader to unbridle people
Yeah.
and do it in a way that you're unafraid, show your vulnerability, and get it. You're a coach. He talks in the book about how important it was that he had a coach. Now imagine, the CEO of Best Buy talking about how critical the coach was to him all the time. So he had
Yeah.
his personal coach. He really sought external input into what he was doing. So he's been a tremendous influence on me now in sort of the back half of my career. And both of those leaders are, I think, walk on sort of hallowed ground, and combine that with John Mackey at Whole Foods and Raj with conscious capitalism. And I think it all starts to converge, at least for me. I ran technology, so I'm a technologist, but I'm an anthropologist and I worked in financial services. And there's this convergence now in the world of social sciences and culture and technology. But always at the center of that is people. And as long
Yeah.
as you can remember that I view everything through the lens of humanity. I just got excited when you started talking about, your indigenous population. I would, that's what my heart and soul sits is, authentic leadership is really about respecting all of those attributes of the macroeconomy. So that excites me more than anything.
You've mentioned so many traits of great leaders and you've shared some real life examples of some great leaders. But if you were to provide some advice to an aspiring leader, what are some of the traits that they need to help develop within themselves to make them a great leader?
So, it sounds trite around this idea of courage. So I take that off the table because I think it could be many different interpretations of what courage is. I think what I've learned is that you just have to be authentic. And
Yeah.
this idea of authentic leadership means that it's okay to say, I'm not quite sure, or to admit when you're wrong, or to, drive change when you're most successful. But I think this idea of putting purpose in people and caring, this idea of love leadership in the center of your decision making, is really where we have evolved to. And
Yeah.
that's a scary proposition because it's one thing to talk about, what are the revenue trends and speak to the stock analysts about where the company's headed. But it's quite another to be intentional about the conversation of loving the people that work with you. And, new leaders need to think about inclusion, but intentional inclusion. So there's this intentionality behind leadership now that I think we've never had, at least not me, for the past couple of decades. So being vulnerable, being authentic, working around an environment where you demand inclusion, where you think about diversity as just the norm of what you do. I'm seeing so many leaders emerge in that area, and it becomes very selfless, right? So are you willing to give and are you willing to care and be intentional about the people and the purpose that you have? And then remain committed to your purpose. But your role as a leader is to uplift the people and the communities within which you work. And if
Yeah.
you can provide, back to my thing about dignity, if you can provide dignity and uplift to people, you have now, got quite a foundation upon which to grow your company.
Absolutely. It sounds what you've just talked about is just being mirrored. I'm hopeful that it's being mirrored by leaders right around the world. The concept that you talked about, the leadership love or love leadership, I would imagine there's also this whole proportion of leaders that sort of cringe at that and maybe get some tingles up their back as they bristle at that sort of language.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's about genuine care, isn't it? It's about actually having a genuine care and curiosity around our people, and really working to understand that so that we can help them be the best that they can be, and along the journey, of course, they're going to help the business. So
I just saw something, and you reminded me that it was the former CEO from Saks Fifth Avenue who went on to lead Ralph Lauren internationally, and he was talking at something I was at, and he said that the greatest leaders always remain curious. And you just use that, there's this ongoing curiosity. And so if you combine the curiosity about people along with this desire to remain committed to a purpose and to the greater good, you're right. It really, people think, oh, that's when it comes in, oh, she's an anthropologist, right? That's why she talks like that. She didn't go to the Wharton School of Business. But the fact is, I believe, as do many other people, and I think the proof of the pudding is in Best Buy and Southwest Airlines
yeah,
and successful organizations that, Whole Foods, that are conscious capitalists, that do care, that really do believe in this model of love, leadership, and inclusion, that really prove out the point better than I do as an anthropologist.
yeah. For yourself, Anita, what's the vision moving forward?
Oh, I want to remain curious. I want to leave the world a better place. I want to leave my mark around social good. So for me, financial dignity is my passion, as you can
Yeah,
see right from, my original storytelling. The idea that we can tell stories and that those stories become the mythology, and ultimately, we all sit around the corporate fires, if you will, and campfires and share those stories is really where I'm headed. I would love to be at a point where financial dignity is accepted as a basic human right, whether it's your indigenous population or the U.S. But at the core, people deserve to have financial dignity. That might mean that at birth, the governments all figure out how that you set up a $25 savings account for every
yeah,
child when they're born, or you create bonds and you fund financial literacy around the world. I think that for me, financial inclusion is my passion. And I think if we could get that right and we could provide people with that dignity, we would all be surprised at how quickly social unrest and many of these other social noises, if you will, how that will come and resolve itself, because economic dignity is at the core of all of that, of all of those
yeah,
inequities. And so
yeah,
for me, it's about how do you solve for that, and how do you solve for the unbanked situation? How do you create alternative financial services in a good way for people who don't
yeah,
have any other choices? And I'm delighted to be at Salary Finance to do that, because that's our mission, is to help
yeah,
people find financial happiness. And it doesn't get any simpler than that, right? So it's one thing to have your physical health and your mental health, and now we just need to add financial health on that as a
yeah.
basic human right.
And it makes so much sense because financial health or lack of financial health will impact you in all those other areas anyway. It's going to impact you mentally, it's going to impact you physically. And interestingly, what you've just talked about with setting people up with education very early in the piece around, bank accounts and financial systems. Here in Australia, we had a very successful program called the Dolomites account, which was one of the banks. It was the Commonwealth Bank here in Australia. And it has been going for decades, where kids were given a little money box and they had their own savings plan, and the education was there. And recently, I'm not fully up to date with why the reasons, but it was recently disbanded, and part of the reason was because of the maybe there was some unconscious, some poor conduct from the bank itself. I'm not quite sure, but it was a very successful system that taught kids how to save, the benefits of saving, and it brought lifelong relationships, and maybe that was part of the issue as well. I'm not quite sure. But it's interesting because financial education is very much part of the process. If people don't understand the benefits of having a bank account, I mean, here in Australia, most people now, I would imagine 90% of people get their their wages or their salaries put straight into a bank account. It's the first thing that you've got to provide to an organisation. So
Yes, we as well.
the education behind that is really important as well.
Yeah, I think again, if my studies were going to be in the Middle East as an anthropologist, the first thing that I
Yeah,
would learn to be successful would be the language. And money and the financial systems are no different. In order to participate fully, you've got to learn the language. And
yeah,
we don't teach the language in school. I have a PhD. I never had a single class on financial literacy throughout my entire
wow,
schooling. And I often share that the first time I received options from Chase, I did not know
yeah,
what they were. I had no idea. And so you think about that. How do you get through all that schooling and then participate? And I only had a 401k because when I joined Occidental Petroleum, which was my first job, the CIO said, "You must do this." And this is how, I mean, he just said, "You're turning away free money." And that resonated. So I said it before, but I had no idea. I mean, what I picked where the investments went, I had no idea, right? So teaching people the language of money is a first step in that. And if you can break it down to be just that simple, that if you don't speak the language, you are not going to be successful. So we can start as simple as a language. We could enforce the fact that it should be taught. It should be a mandatory class. You know, throughout school, you should have mandatory courses around financial literacy. It's not even a requirement to graduate in most states in the U.S. from high school. So, you know, we enter the workplace completely uninformed. And you know, then there's all the stigmas that you put around it, we put around it culturally, that you really don't talk about money. It's, you know, taboo to talk about money. Then where do you get your information? Thank God for podcasts, you know, the podcasts, that the world now, you can, you know, dial into lots of podcasts, but those aren't all vetted, so who knows what kind of education you're getting along the way.
And there's also a couple of pretty ordinary ones where people are getting advice that maybe they shouldn't be getting. Yes. So it's nice to get the right sort of information, which you've provided today, Anita.
Oh,
so
thank you.
How can people connect with you?
So salaryfinance.com is our organization. My email is connected to that. Please reach out to us. You know, I'd love to chat with you more, and maybe we can create a social movement around financial dignity around, you know, around the world, and connect employers along the way. So I really appreciate you allowing me to share the story, allowing me to share salary finance, and you know, I'd love if people reach out to us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show and investing in today's leader. And I wish you every success in your mission and your vision for a better world. Let's hope that everyone can achieve that level, or some level of financial dignity.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now, it's time for Tony's 2 cents.
As leaders, we are often unaware of the things that we are unaware of. Sounds pretty obvious, doesn't it? So from a personal and from a team point of view, if we're unaware of something, it's hard for us sometimes to understand what is happening in people's lives. The world in which I live, for example, isn't the world in which the people I lead live, or the people that I have led live. And when you hear statistics like the ones Anita shared, that 5.4% of the US households, approximately 7.1 million people, don't have a bank account in 2019, it makes you truly wonder about the impact and the corresponding impact that has on the people within your team, within your organisation. When you have no idea of that and no idea of what is going on, it's very hard to help and support the team in the way that you should be, in the way that you could be as a leader. And as we heard from Anita, team members facing financial distress, the corresponding impact will be felt in the workplace. Guaranteed. How does a leader show that they care in those situations in a non-judgmental, non-threatening, while understanding perception of invasiveness and the need for privacy and confidentiality? There's a whole lot of things in that bucket which we need to be aware of as a leader. And unfortunately, that's what stops many leaders from providing support and help that is required. The ability to have financial wellness and dignity included in benefit programs, part of ongoing discussions, the ability to speak with qualified and counselled people is of huge benefit to organisations right around the world, I would imagine, but also right here in Australia. And whether that's driven through business or advocates for employees, does it really matter? If it's helping the performance of the people, the self-esteem, the self-confidence, the dignity of the people, it has to be beneficial to the community. And I think that's one of the most important things that we need to understand. Now, lockdowns and stand-downs have highlighted the concern where many people are living paycheck to paycheck. We know that. We will often talk about that. But the lockdowns and the stand-downs really brought that out to the fore. And financial education may in some part alleviate some of those concerns in that particular area. It's not the sole solution, but it may help alleviate and may help bring awareness into these problems that are being faced. Now, particularly small business owners, especially sole traders, felt the pain and the dignity implications during these times as well. In a lot of cases, sole traders' work just dried up. And it's incredibly hard and difficult for a sole trader to sort of go back to the workplace. Many of them become unemployable in their own eyes, that they would struggle going back to work with a boss. But one of the things we know is that small business is absolutely crucial for community development. So as a nation here in Australia and as a world in all its contexts, local governments, state governments, national governments, this discussion needs to be had in relation to how can we create financial dignity for the people that rely on us to be making the right and most important decisions. How can we support initiatives like this if we're not willing to have the discussions? And once again, I'd just like to thank Anita for some of the amazing insights that she provided today. And of course, if you're wanting to connect with Anita, please note that her links are in the show notes. If you're looking to build better leadership skills, check out the Today's Leader website at todaysleader.com.au. We really are driving a leadership revolution to build tomorrow's best leaders today. Today's Leader is a collective, the mindset to make a difference, the ability to create an impact. Think and Grow Business hosts our Today's Leader Mastermind. Think and Grow Business, where we focus on personal, professional, and business growth. Book your free 30-minute discovery call right from the homepage at thinkandgrowbusiness.com.au. Don't forget, wherever you are standing stronger, braver, and wiser. Don't forget the golden rule. Don't be an arsehole. I'll see you all again next week. Bye for now.